Welcome to the Richmond Public Library's Dungeons & Dragons Resource Guide. Today's guest is Peter Darbyshire. So welcome to Richmond Public Library's Dungeons & Dragons tutorials. We are here with author Peter Darbyshire, and he's the author of some really fantastic paranormal books. He writes about the end of the world, which is very timely these days. And of course, he is a Dungeons & Dragons enthusiast. So it's very exciting to be able to talk to Peter about all of this. Thank you for coming on to our show.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah. So Dungeons and Dragons, tell me a little bit about your first experiences with it.
Oh my gosh. My first memories of D&D are essentially my first memories. I've been playing it since elementary school. Probably grade 4 or 5, somewhere around there, and I can't remember too much before that. I'm in my 50s now, so it's going back a ways. I'm old enough that I played original D&D. Like the original box set. I've got it was like this sort of thing. This is the retro version they come out now that I bought for my kids, my 10-year-old. But yeah, I remember playing the original thing, and it was sort of wrapped up in my writing too. Like that was around the same time that I started to write. There were a few things that kind of kicked off that creative spark in me, and D&D was one. The first Star Wars film that I saw at a drive-in. Again, aging myself, but saw that, and so there were a few things like that really sort of woke me up as a writer and as a creative person, and I think I owe a lot of my creativity to Dungeons and Dragons.
It's kind of interesting. Everybody, I think, our age has either Dungeons and Dragons, Star Wars, those two things. Like, I don't think you can find anybody that hasn't been inspired by at least one of those two things, if they're our age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, we get all the revitalization of the Star Wars films now, and all the new series and everything now that Disney's bought them. And we're seeing all of the we talked about this before, about all the Hollywood celebrities who are doing their D&D sessions, right, and recording them, right. They're not trying to hide them, like it was always, when I was younger, it was kind of the nerdy thing, and now it's like the mainstream, right. And I think there was just enough of us playing it, but there was also things like the Lord of the Rings movie came out, I think, which really, or that trilogy came out and really put that kind of fantasy stuff into the mainstream, because the technology was finally there to do it. It was the fantasy equivalent of Star Wars, I think, right? And I think that got a lot of people interested in it, and I think those films probably came out because they knew there was an audience there, because all the people that play D&D, right? So I think these things kind of keep feeding into each other. It's like we see all the people who were inspired by D&D who became writers, and now we're seeing all the books that are inspired by D&D, right? People are starting to write the sort of the orcs version of the tale, or the goblins version of the tale, or the roaming adventurers, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how you came up with the idea for your cross books.
So yeah, the first one, which I write under the pen name Peter Roman, the Mona Lisa Sacrifice, was I'd done the usual English undergraduate degree, and we did some Old English poetry and that kind of thing. As one of those required courses. And I came across this like fascinating poem called "The Dream of the Rood," which was the telling of the crucifixion, Christ's crucifixion, from the cross's point of view, like from the cross's perspective, after Christ has ascended and all that. So the cross is kind of reflecting on this important moment. It was a fascinating, concept, right? Like to tell that big important moment in human history from the viewpoint of this wooden cross that had once been a tree. Um, and I was sort of reflecting on the idea of the Christ as the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, and all that kind of stuff, and leaving the physical world behind, and what remains, of him, like the root and stuff like that. And it just popped into my head the idea of the body as being the root, right? Because Christ is so much about the Spirit. And then I just thought, what happened to that body, right? Like, what if that body, was the equivalent of the root, carrying that Spirit, and just got left behind? What happened to it then? And then I got the idea, well, what happens if another soul pops into that body, right, and has access to all of Christ's powers? So that was a sort of basic premise, and then I came up with the idea of this character who's been living since the crucifixion, or keeps dying, but the body keeps resurrecting him, the same spirit in there, who has these supernatural powers, but none of Christ's morals or ethics or quest for redemption or anything like that. He's a rogue. He's a scoundrel. He hangs out with monsters like gorgons and and he hangs out with the fairy. He has this torrid love affair with the fairy, and he's constantly getting involved in human mythology throughout the ages. He hangs out with King Arthur, gets in trouble with King Arthur, fights a dragon, all those sorts of things. The books are set in the present day, but there's tons of flashbacks. And so that was the basic premise. So kind of like D&D, it was inspired by myth, right? Like Dungeons and Dragons, it's a lot of those ancient stories that feed into it. And the same thing with those books. I wanted to take something and have this modern world that was largely fed by our myths rather than creating an entirely separate fantasy world.
Yeah. So when you're creating these books, we're going to talk a little bit about magic and spell casting and that kind of part of Dungeons and Dragons, which in D&D I find, I don't know how you find 5th edition, but compared to the only editions I have that I've played are Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Basic Dungeons and Dragons, and then this one. And I find that when it comes to spell casting, there are so many rules and things that you have to remember, and the difference between cantrips and do you have the verbal components and the physical components and all of that. So in your books and in your gaming, how do you handle that kind of rule making?
Well, I think I'm like you. I started with original D&D and I moved on to the revolutionary, advanced Dungeons and Dragons, right? Which, boom, there's different rule books for players and dungeon masters and monster manual and that was actually enough for me. That was a rich enough world, and I would buy the modules and the adventures, the pre-made adventures, but I often made my own. And then I took a break for many years just because life. And then when I came back to start playing again, I was usually a DM before, but I sort of came back as a player this time. And I came back on the Dungeon Master was running a 5th edition, and I enjoyed it because there was a very rich and diverse world, but the rules really threw me because the gameplay felt so much more kind of structured and regimented, and I had to really be aware of the rules to play my character to the best of my ability, and things like that. And I found that I actually kind of preferred the AD&D, right? Because there was a little more focus on the imagination, and sort of imagining what was happening rather than, okay, now you have your opportunity attack. It's that part of the phase, right, of the turn. And that kind of reflects the way that I like to see things represented in fantasy worlds in general, like not just in D&D, but in my reading too, and in my writing. When I came up with the cross books, I thought, well, I mean, am I going to do like a very systematic kind of form of magic, right? Because he's a guy who can literally do miracles. Or am I just going to say there's some general rules around it, and then the magic will sort of fit the narrative, like the story that I'm telling? And that was the way I decided to go. He's able to do his magic abilities through heavenly grace, which he steals from angels usually by killing them, because him and angels don't get along for the most part. And then he uses that grace to do whatever he wants: walk on water, he often turns water into wine, makes his skin hard, or resurrects people, or resurrects himself, when he gets killed, which is often because he does stupid things quite a bit. And I really only had that one basic rule, right? Here's where his power come from. It's the equivalent. Grace is the equivalent of mana, in D&D, right? And everything after that kind of serves the story. And that's I think when you create a fantasy world, you have to make that choice. Is it going to be about, the world building, the system, or is it going to be about the wonder of the magic? And when you do that world building, like D&D always has you need the ingredients for spells, right? Like you need a basilisk eye and a scroll and this and that, right? And I always think that's really interesting, because if that was the case, you would start to see industries grow up around that, right? Because of human ingenuity. Like there'd be basilisk farms, right? And and if you needed to sleep 8 hours after casting your spell to rejuvenate, there'd be like little hotels that were very calm and quiet and restful. So you can do that kind of world building and make it all very systematic, or you can you can make it all kind of very unknowable and, really embrace the magic, right? Like, I've got a magic sword +1. Why is it +1? Because it was bathed in Gorgon blood, right? Or I've got a flaming sword. And so you can be, okay, there's a special blacksmith who specializes in making flaming swords. Or somebody was fighting a dragon and the dragon breathed fire and some of the fire got in the sword and it stuck to it and continues to burn. And thus it's a magical flaming sword, right? So there's different ways you can go at it. I like the wondrous, don't explain it. It's just a fun story. Because I think at a certain point, if you explain the magic too much, it takes away the magic, right? So that's just my personal preference.
When you said the basilisk farm, all of a sudden I had all of these creative ideas going on in my head, and I thought to myself, wouldn't that be a great campaign where there is a basilisk farm, and the whole campaign is that the owner of the farm accidentally forgot to lock the gate, and now there's all these basilisks roaming the countryside that he's hired you to go and round up, and you can't kill them because this is his livelihood,
Yeah.
and you have to figure out a way to capture a basilisk live to bring it back.
Yeah, now I want to. I either want to play that adventure or run that adventure, create it. But I think I would change from basilisks to beholders because they're so unpredictable. So each one would be different, right, because of their crazy powers.
That'd be great. Yeah, a beholder farm. I like that. All right, there's our task for next time. We're going to create this campaign and we'll run it. This is we'll call it the Beholder Farm.
Well, we need to make sure we tell the beholder's point of view too, though.
Oh, for sure. Because well, I mean, the beholders wanted to get away because they've got families that they've been taken from.
That's
And
right.
yeah, I like this. This is kind of good. Do you have a favorite mythology that you are particular to, or just mythology in general?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just always like fascinated by new creative stuff, and you often see parallels. I remember reading the Joseph Campbell books, when I was younger, and you going around. I think it was Mass of God, I think the series was called, where you'd look at this mythology and this society is essentially the same as this one in this society, and they had never had any contact with each other. So we have, again, we have these universal impulses to make meaning out of things. But my mythology would be D&D. That's what I grew up with, right? And I think we've talked about this before too. How I find the stuff that I find really interesting in D&D is actually the stuff that originated in D&D, and a lot of it didn't, right? Like dragons, and orcs sort of came from outside of D&D, right? And so they're a bit limited in what they can do with those creatures and races in the game, and it's things like the beholders that I actually find really interesting, that are D&D constructs, right, that are the mythology of D&D, and in many ways have become the faces of Dungeons and Dragons as well, because they're these unique things that didn't exist before that, right, and some of them are pretty crazy. And we see those sorts of things come up in not just D&D. Like I'm staring across my room here at my Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, which I remember playing again when I was younger, back when it wasn't the mainstream thing, and now you've got the Cthulhu plushies, and everything is Lovecraft, right, for better or worse. And that's a mythology that has really seeped into the mainstream in the same way that the Lord of the Rings sort of did after those films. I mean, I think Lord of the Rings was kind of there already, but like really exploded in the mainstream after those films. So, do I have a favorite? I just pull in pieces from all of them, right? And, that's why I loved Shadowrun so much, the role playing game Shadowrun, because it was like, well, we're going to mix up cyberpunk with dragons, with magic, and like in Blade Runner, and like it was all of those mythologies just mashed up in a blender, and I absolutely adored that.
It just made me think of the fact that you and I had actually been test playing the same game in two different groups with somebody that was creating their own game and their own mythology behind it and stuff. And I just find it really interesting just what a small world it is, because I've heard your name through mutual friends all the time. And then we knew each other, on Facebook, uh, you know, but just through Dungeons and Dragons, it's even though we're both writers, it's D&D that I always heard your name through, which
Oh, that's funny.
because it's such a small community.
Well, and it's such a social shared experience. Like when I think back of my memories of D&D, like they're memories of playing with other people, right? Like it's not like playing Dungeons and Dragons on the computer, against the AI, right? Like, I've probably done countless fantasy games, but I don't remember those moments. They're sort of, I zen out in the, to
Hmm.
unwind at the end of the day or whatever, but they don't stick with me. Whereas I still remember, games from when I was a teenager and characters I had, but I remember them because of the interactions with the other people, and I think that's the wonderful thing about Dungeons and Dragons or Shadowrun or whatever is this story that you create together, right? Like it's not just the DM. I mean, it can be just the dungeon master, the games master running people through a campaign, and you're on a track or a rail or whatever you want to call it. Um, you're going from room to room in the dungeon and you've got no say in things, right? But often, like, it's not that, and a good game isn't that. A good game is the players contributing, as much. You've seen this where you've been running a campaign and the players come up with some crazy idea and you're like, well, we got to pause the session for this week while I figure that one out, right? And go home and write like a totally different campaign, right? Because like that's the wonderful thing. Players, will bring their own thing. Like even when I played the video games like World of Warcraft, I was always interested in the ones that were the where you could really interact with the other players, right? Because the AI is, they're boring. You can always figure
Hmm.
them out. They're just a puzzle to figure out. But other players, other human beings, will always throw something creative at you that derails everything you had in mind, right? And is wonderful at the same time, right?
Yeah.
It's the unpredictable. It's the magic, right? The other players are the magic in the storytelling process.
And I think that's what I like about D&D is the collaborative process. And what you were saying too about remembering the adventures from when you were a teenager. Me too. Like I still remember all the adventures that my friend. I don't know that I remember my friends necessarily as much because it's been many many years, but I can remember all the adventures that we went on in Dungeons and Dragons. And even now with my my current friends, whenever we get together, we very often wind up going on to these big conversations about, oh, do you remember that time we were we were in this dungeon and the beholder suddenly came out, and people who don't play D&D will look at us and say, you all understand this isn't real, right?
It's real in your mind though, right?
Yeah.
It's real in the imagination, right? Those fun experiences, those joyous experiences are real.
Yeah, and it definitely feeds into the writing too, with just inspiring you to want to like. As soon as I'm finished a D&D game, the first thing I want to do is just go start working on a book. Like I
Yeah,
just want to go and write like that. The
yeah.
the juices are going. The imagination is running wild. So I know you have a book of short stories that are coming out.
So I had a book of short stories come out recently called "Has the World Ended Yet?" and they were apocalypse stories. Lots of angels. So the title story is angels falling down to Earth in the middle of this superhero retirement colony, essentially, and nobody knows what the angels want. So everybody thinks it's the end of the world, but they're not quite sure. I've got another story about a guy who can do what's called casual miracles. So he can do miracles, but not anything that actually changes anybody's life in any meaningful way. So he just advertises on Craigslist and kind of makes side living off of it. So I had all these sort of scenarios about the world ending, and of course, like the one thing I didn't have in the book was a pandemic. So I feel like I totally missed the boat on that one. Right? So I need to write a sequel about that. But I've also got a short story collection that I've finished. I'm just workshopping with my writing group now on the cross in the cross universe. So short stories of Cross getting into various misadventures throughout the ages. So there's a Wild West Cross story and a fairy tale Cross story and things like that.
And when you play D&D, do you have a favorite character class that you like to play?
Well, these days I often will play warriors because they're easier, right? Because I only kind of dip in and out. So just give me something that can just swing a sword and get in the middle of the action and vent my frustrations for the day. When I actually have time, I do prefer playing the magic characters, and that's sort of across the board. When I was playing World of Warcraft, I always preferred playing mages or warlocks, right? Like somebody who had magic ability. And I just find them interesting characters to play. So I admit I sort of run towards like the sort of necromancer kind of angle wherever possible in any kind of role playing game. I like the sort of dark mages who are operating in the shadows or the gray zones at least. who often have companions, imps or whatever. Um, but I find that they're a little trickier to play too, right? So you have to be in sort of the right headspace for them as well.
In my current game, one of the character classes I've discovered I like to DM is the bard, which can be
Oh,
super
really?
fun if played well. So we're in my current game, they're in this world that's a jungle, and we had a new player that wanted to start. So of course you have to figure out, how do I introduce this character to the story so that it makes sense. It's not just suddenly this guy's been traveling with you all the time. And so what we did was the current party came across a civilization inside of this jungle, and there's this bard character who's very charismatic, but not really all that great of a leader. Really, he's just really charismatic, as bards are. And so we did this apocalypse now kind of thing where he's the leader of these people, and they all follow him and they practically worship him, but really he doesn't know what he's doing, and he's just accepted it because this is good for him right now. And then when the party comes, he sees this as his exit and way out of these people. So he's
Nice.
like, take me with you. And that's how we introduced that one character. And it was hilarious. It was so much fun. So do you have a favorite book that either inspired you or that you recommend to people?
Um, well, that's a tough one. I mean, I'm always recommending books, but I'm recommending books that I think people will like, not
Yeah.
necessarily that are my favorite books, right? I mean, I've got sort of a list of books that I actually want to be buried with, right? Books that were meaningful to me through my life. And some are my friends, books, right? They're very, very meaningful to me. And some are books that, I grew up with that like Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny is a really important series for me. Lord of the Rings is really important for me. The those Raymond Chandler books, like I think are wonderful pieces of those Philip Marlowe books are wonderful pieces of fiction. Annie Proulx's Close Range is I still think about that book to this day, and so many years ago that I've read it multiple times. So and not all these books have aged well and all that, but
Yeah.
I'm okay with nostalgia, right? For the sake of nostalgia sometimes. So I can recognize that, I wouldn't recommend maybe some of those books today, but they're important to me and they're important to my, formative processes and, not just creativity, but in many different ways, right? So those are sort of the ones you know, that leap to mind, right? Like definitely, Roger Zelazny, I think, was probably the biggest influence on me as a writer, and then probably Lord of the Rings. And I don't think I've ever done anything that would even remotely resemble Lord of the Rings, but it's just that imagination, that explosion of imagination, right? That world building and all that kind of stuff. It just opens your eyes to what's possible,
Yeah.
right?
And the quest. I think, I mean, the cross books are basically a quest.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think Lord of the Rings kind of set everything in our imaginations for those of us who are big fans of it. Even if we don't write about orcs and swords and sorcery and all of that, we're still writing about that great quest of good versus evil.
Yeah, it's the heart of every story, right? It's a character trying to overcome some obstacle, right? And make the world a better place, right? Like even like those Philip Marlowe books, like their quest books, right? And he's trying to one person trying to make some small amount of change in the world. Even though the books are pretty cynical about big change, right? Like Lord of the Rings style change, right? But you've got like the one sort of white knight character who's trying to do what they can in the world, right? And so um that's I think any book, right? Like Annie Proulx, you could say Brokeback Mountain is somebody trying to make change in the world, right? That's a magical piece of writing, right? So yeah, that quest, yeah, it goes back to Joseph Campbell. There's that
Yeah.
universal thing that we see in all cultures, right? And the quest narrative is always it's always, I think, one of the first ones. And I remember when people were first talking about Star Wars and Joseph Campbell, and I was like, oh, right, okay, I get it, right? So
Again, I'm going to thank you for doing this twice. And for not making it feel like we did it twice. So it's always a really great conversation with you, and It's super interesting. So yeah, really appreciate you doing this.
Public Library's Resource Guide. Today we'll be talking about creating your own homebrewed story. We just had an interview with Peter Darbyshire, and in that interview we talked about creating a beholder ranch where people could go and get magical components. We have created a beholder ranch one-shot game, and I'm going to show you how we did this. So the things that you would need in order to create this game are very simple. First, you need a storyline. You need a map or several maps. For this particular campaign, we're going to be using the Druid, and it's the Circle of the Shepherd class that's found in Xanathar's guide. We're going to be using the Beholder, which is the version of it will be the Spectator. And we're going to be using the Beholder kin tactics from the Monsters Know What They're Doing website. So what I want to show you first is the kin tactics from the Monsters Know What They're Doing website. This is a really great website if you're unsure of how monsters would react with your players. He has lots of different monsters that you can check out. This is on the Beholder, and this is how they would react to adventurers coming into their territory. The Spectator Beholder is kind of an interesting one to choose for this module because they are from a different plane. They're brought over by a wizard, and they are usually set to guard something for 102 years. So once their 102 years is up, then they often have no more purpose. They don't know, they can't get home, so they start to go mad. So the story hook that I wound up coming up with after chatting with Peter is that this is going to be a ranch. The ranch works as kind of a rescue shelter for wayward beholder spectators. The druid, who is now retired, she has created this ranch. She has found a few beholders that she protects. And my storyline, which is right here, is basically what's going to get the players interested in helping out Chrysantra, because the problem, because there always has to be a problem with the story, is that her beholders have escaped and she needs them captured, but she needs them captured alive. So there is the problem for the adventurers, that they can't just go out and kill something. They actually have to go out and figure out how to capture something alive that's very dangerous and then bring it back. So I had to give a reason why her beholders would have escaped. So I came up with the idea that she used to travel with a whole bunch of other adventurers. At one point, her first experience with a spectator, actually, she felt sorry for it, but the party that she traveled with killed it anyway. And she decided to dedicate her life to helping spectators after that. Of course, the party that she traveled with mysteriously perished. There's a rumor that maybe she had something to do with it, maybe she didn't, so it gives a little bit of mystery into the adventure. There was only one survivor. So that one survivor, who is a dragonborn barbarian, has vowed revenge on her, and possibly that's why the bolt beholders are loose. So you can play this in one of two ways. You can have the party, be hired directly by Chrysantra. You can have the party find out about it in a. They can find out about it at a tavern. They could also be hired by the Dragonborn as a way to go take care of the beholders, and then maybe they meet up with Chrysantra, and now they have to decide if they're going to, if they're going to follow the Dragonborn or if they're going to follow the Druid. So there's lots of really great story hooks that you can have. In my story hooks, I haven't finished writing those yet, so I just have the one, but as you can see, it's coming up with story hooks. They're usually pretty easy once you have the storyline finished. Coming up with things like the village, the NPCs, I have a dungeon, so I had to have places where these beholders would be. So one of the places the beholders is in a sewer underneath the city or underneath the village. One of the beholders is in a dungeon in a mountain, and one of the beholders is kind of wandering the countryside. Those are my so that's where the party has to go to. So how do you create all of this without spending months and months and months? You know, you want to play this weekend, you've only got a few days, you want to have something that's going to be really fun. So what do you do? So there's lots of really cool little tips and tricks that you can do. The first that I want to show you is Donjon, which I have mentioned before in another resource guide. Donjon is a really good way of coming up with really quick, cool ideas. This one I did the random town generator, and I didn't use the map. It does create a little map for you, and you could, but I wanted to have something that was a little bit possibly uploaded into Roll20 or something like that. And you can actually decide exactly how you want everything to be too. So you can just change everything. So you got lots of different things that you can do. So basically, I took this as my sort of beginning idea, and it has things like the population, government, notable places, and a few NPCs that you can use. I didn't use these NPCs here. So what I did was I went to the D&D 5e because that's what we're playing, and I went to random generator. And under random generator has a whole bunch of different things that you can do. I did NPCs, and in my little town, I had mostly dwarves. And then if I was looking for a specific class, I could change the classes around as well. And then I use these because it gives you the strength, the dex, the constitution, intelligence, everything. So anything that you need basically for creating your NPC, it's all here. And that's how I created a few interesting NPCs real fast. And just as a reminder, NPC stands for non-player character, so that's any character that the dungeon master is playing. Those are the ones that you would use. And then that gave me my town. So I had my village, I had my random generator. I also had an inn that I had as a notable place. So I did the random inn generator, and you have all sorts of really cool things. Like it even gives you a menu and everything. So it's just a lot of fun. So this is a really good way of coming up with a lot of really fast ideas, really easily. And then for creating my map of the town, I used Incarnate, and Incarnate helped me to just create a real quick map. I have a tutorial for this with the interview that I did with Art Slade in creating a fantasy world. And as you can see, this one has a grid, so every square equals 5 feet. This is actually a map of the Druid's Ranch, so you can see where the beholders were kept, and the NPC the players are going to have to figure out how to find the beholders. So giving them lots of hints and stuff too. So then after creating the maps, I wanted to create a dungeon because, and this is a pretty big dungeon. I have to say this would definitely be longer than a one shot, unless you make it super easy. But in my dungeon, they come into room 1, and they come into room 1 through when they make their way through the up the mountain. Obviously this is an encounter map, a battle map, and they're trying to get to this little hole in the ground, and that's where they're going to enter into the dungeon. And then the way that I have it too is if they're foolish enough to just jump in without having some sort of a rope or something, then they're going to have to figure out how to get out because that's just a hole in the ceiling, which sometimes can be kind of fun. Just make sure that if you do that, you always give them something to get their way out. So to create the dungeon, I used Donjon again, and I just went to the random dungeon generator, which is under fantasy, and it's just right here. and it gives you all of these options. So I think I went for medium size, and it for one shot probably small is good. After you hit construct, you are going to have your dungeon map. You can download it as a player's map, so it doesn't have these numbers in it, or you can do the DM map, and the DM map will have the numbers, and then it also gives you a little bit about what's in each room. It's really not a lot. This is just a start of what you can do. You obviously want to tailor it more to whatever story you've constructed. So I just copied it and then I pasted it right into this program, which I'm going to show you as well. It can make your adventure look like an actual professional adventure, which is kind of fun. It's kind of cool. And so this was mine that I created using the Don John dungeon generator, and then I just tweaked it to fit what my storyline. And then the other thing that you're going to want after you have your village, you have your dungeon possibly, is you're going to want your major players. So you need to know everything about, like, I have Cassandra, who is my druid, and I also have my 3 beholders, Goker, Itch, and Alosh. If you're wondering how to come up with some really interesting names, there is the fantasy name generator, and there is also one right in Donjon, but this is the one that I used, and then I just click on fantasy names. It gives you a whole bunch of different ideas, and you can come up with some really unique sounding names. So that's what I did. I just used the fantasy name generator. And then once you have that, you have your players, you have your NPCs. You want to make sure that you have all of your encounters. So I created a random encounter table, and again, I just used Donjon for that. So in Donjon, I just went to D&D 5e, and then I went to random encounter generator. And looking up the beholder spectator, this is it right here. This is right on D&D Beyond, which is a good resource for a lot of really good D&D information. It's run by Wizards of the Coast. And you can see that this one is a challenge rating 3. So when I'm creating my random encounter tables, I'm going to have it level 3, depending upon how many players there are. So this will actually make it harder or easier. And then I can decide, they're going to be in the forest. And here it is. So here is all of my, I roll a d10, and then I know what's going to be attacking them. If I want there to be treasure found, because that just makes the game more fun, I can also click on individual treasure, and it will give it some treasure. And of course, if you're going to create your own little adventure, then you want to have some interesting treasure as well. So maybe create some things that don't exist in the DM's guide, or it doesn't exist in the official books, because that just makes it a little bit fun. So a good way of doing that, I use the Donjon random generator again. So I just went to random treasure generator, and then I went to magic items, and this is basically, I just looked through it and I found some things that looked kind of fun, and then I played with it from there. You can make different spell books, things like that. So for example, one of the ones that I made for this particular game that's completely unique is a Ring of Beholder protection. I didn't want to give my players protection from beholders forever, but I also didn't want them to get wiped out in the first encounter when they're trying to capture something alive, right? So with this one, you have to be within 15 feet of the beholder. The wearer gains a +1 bonus to armor class and saving throws while wearing this ring. I would probably even maybe change that and give them advantage in saving throws while wearing this ring, because they're going to be making a lot of saving throws with the beholder. Little things like that make the game a lot more fun. And if you're wanting to create something that looks like this, I used something called the Homebrew. So this might look a little bit difficult, but it's actually quite easy to use. On the left-hand side, it has my code. On the right-hand side, it has what it's going to look like. So I can sort of see it right in action. Going back to the original page of the home brewery, it has a tutorial built right in, and really all you have to do is test it out, and just you'll learn how to use it pretty quickly. So the title, there you go, and then you can save your own. I logged into this. I created an account and then I logged into it to save it right to my Google Drive. It's really easy to use this program and to create some really interesting looking PDFs. My PDF looks like this. You can put on images. In order to host images, even with, or to put images into this rather, you have to host them somewhere. I used Imager to host the images just for the PDF, and then I just followed the code that was given right with the program itself. And that's how you too can make your own one-shot campaign using all of these tools.
Thank you for tuning in to Richmond Public Library's Dungeons & Dragons Resource Guide. Tune in next time for more topics or send us your questions. We'd love to answer them.